Welcome, comrades, to what is our third election 2024 meeting. We are the Republican Labour Education Forum, which has been developing various ideas about working class republicanism since we were set up in 2023. So we're now taking what we're now doing is taking the opportunity of the election campaign to present our ideas to a wider audience. In effect, I suppose you could say we are the Commonwealth Party. That is to say, we haven't got any candidates, we haven't got any special funds, we haven't got any members. But this party is going to exist until July the 4th, and when we will resume normal service as the Republican Labour Education Forum. So the basic message, our basic message is that there is a crisis of democracy in this country. There is a kind of degeneration, putrefaction, if you like, or even collapse, as Peter said before, of our welfare state. And this is presenting a danger. This presents a danger to our democracy. And we have located the political side of this crisis in the power of the Crown and the weakness of the Westminster Parliament. England is the most centralised bureaucratic country in Europe. And at the centre of Crown power is His Majesty's Treasury, which controls the finances of the state, which means, in effect, about 50 people are in control of the country. So we want to address these questions by thinking about radical democratic reform, where we put emphasis on the importance of power passing to the people. So two of the things that we are going to promote, or are promoting, we're going to discuss tonight. One of these is the idea of a parliament for England, and the other one is public ownership of land. And that's going to be the subject of tonight's meeting. I should say, before Carol begins as our first speaker, next week on Monday we will be, as it were, unveiling. I suppose you unveil our platform, or perhaps manifesto. You know what I mean? So we'll unveil our program, I hope, next week, which will bring a lot of things together. So without any more ado from me, if comrades want to help our campaign anyway, we've produced a leaflet. We have produced a leaflet, and we'll produce probably, as I say, a manifesto. And please get in touch with us afterwards. Without any more ado from me, I'm going to turn over to Carol, who's maybe going to talk for, I don't know, about 10 or 15 minutes, Carol, on the subject, starting from now. I think don't stop, don't hesitate, don't stop, don't say, on the subject of a parliament for England. Thank you, Carol. Off you go.
To start this discussion, I'm going to talk a little bit about the devolution of the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland parliaments. Now that came in, Blair's government in 1997 came in with the promise that they would do that. And indeed, he did stick to that promise, Blair, and he did bring in devolution for Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales at that time. But it didn't start there. It goes along, this push for autonomy in those countries didn't start in 1998. It goes back a long time before that. For instance, Northern Ireland first got home rule in 1921. Then I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but we're jumping right through to 1998 with the Good Friday Agreement, with power sharing. Jumping on to 2022 when Sinn Féin got a majority and the DUP threw all their toys out of the cot and refused to assent to a speaker. But fortunately, by February the 3rd of this year, 2024, they are back to business. They have a speaker. And in Scotland, the Act of Union happened, of course, in 1707, but that was an imposed Act of Union by the establishment, by the monarchy, etc. And the ordinary people were not very happy about it, and there was a lot of dissent among the ranks, as it were. And in the 19th century, there was a National Association for the Vindication of Scottish Rights, and that was in 1853. The SNP was formed in 1934. In 1969, Harold Wilson commissioned a royal commission on the Constitution, which recommended a devolved Scottish Assembly. And then we have the Scotland Act, which was Blair's government in 1998, establishing Holyrood, which is the Scottish Parliament. But unfortunately, this Parliament is not really free to do exactly as it wants, and we'll discuss that a little bit more later. And particularly the UK Internal Market Act 2020 restricts and undermines the authority of the Scottish Parliament. Turning to Wales, the Laws in Wales Act made Wales a member of England, part of England, in 1535 to 1542. In 1914, the Welsh Church Act got rid of the C of E as being the establishment church, so it disestablished the C of E. Plaid Cymru, I hope I've said that correctly. I apologise to any Welsh people here if I haven't. Plaid Cymru was formed in 1925. There was a Council for Wales and Monmouth in 1949, and the Government of Wales Act in 1998, again due to the Blair government, allowed Wales to decide how to spend its budget from central government. And there was a Government of Wales Act in 2006, created an executive body, the Welsh Government. And in the 6th of May of 2020, the National Assembly was renamed the Senedd Cymru, or the Welsh Parliament, with Senedd being adopted as its name in both languages. So that's a very brief history of how we got devolved parliaments in Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. But of course, England has never had its own parliament. And there has been a number of groups that have supported the idea of an English parliament. The English Commonwealth, English Democrats, Campaign for an English Parliament, the SNP, and Plaid Cymru as well. They've all supported the idea of a parliament for the English. There's been a steadily growing base of support in England for this. Started off with the devolution of the other countries at about 16 to 19%, but it has risen to about 30%. And indeed, on the 22nd of October 2015, the House of Commons voted in favour of implementing a system of English votes for English laws. After an intense debate of the extended period of time of 4 hours. And I'll be coming back to that situation as well later. But this was abolished, unfortunately, in July 2021. Unbelievably, Winston Churchill in 1912 proposed that the government of England should be divided up among regional parliaments, which really surprised me. And there was also in 1969 a Redcliffe Maud report which proposed devolving power to 8 regional assemblies. And this is something that we've got in our manifesto, the ideas that we have for going forward to get democracy into English politics. Now, of course, I want to move on now to why Westminster is almost completely devoid of democracy. The House of Commons didn't have a very auspicious start. The 2 architects who designed it, Charles Barry, who was the older one and the main one, and Pugin, who helped Barry with his drawings, they didn't exactly have a good end. Charles Barry ended up dying of overwork well before he should have done, and Pugin ended up in Bedlam and remained there until his death. So I think you'll agree, not a very auspicious start for the buildings of the Houses of Parliament. Now, with the Crown in Parliament, the monarch asks the PM to form a parliament. Then, I'm sure you're all very aware of this procedure, but I just want to go through it again. And then the PM then uses Crown power to appoint his or her cabinet. Parliament has absolutely no say in this. There's no voting involved. This cabinet then proceeds to roll out legislation, starting with the Parliamentary Business and Legislation Committee. Now, this is made up of really the who's who at the top of the food chain in politics. It's the Leader of the Commons, the Leader of the Lords, the Chief Whip, the Chief Secretary to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and the Attorney General. So I think you'll agree that's right at the top of the tree, nothing from below at all. This committee then asks departments to submit bids for legislation to be put through. So what we've got is an unelected committee asking for bids from departments led by ministers of the Crown who've been chosen by the PM. So not a lot of democracy there. Once the legislation has been drafted, then the government, the ministers of the Crown, have complete control over how much time Parliament has to debate a new bill, which is very little. As I said to you before, that very important bill on English laws being passed by the English Parliament had 4 hours, a whole 4 hours of debate. Even, yeah, so we're going on to, and if we talk about the ordinary MPs, they stand almost no chance of even understanding the changes in legislation proposed. The proposed act will not have the change written out properly. It will refer back to the previous act, that section in the previous act, and that will refer back to the section in the act before that, and so on ad infinitum. So it may be you have to sit there with 7 or 8 acts of Parliament to actually work out what is the change that's being proposed. So obviously doesn't make any sense to do that, and the European Parliament doesn't do that. It's all being worked out to be so much easier to understand. So the other major issue that MPs have is their time. MPs have basically 2 very important parts to their job. They've got their constituency work, which many MPs absolutely love and regard as the most important part of their work. And then they have the legislative work in the House of Commons. So apart from having no time or resources to investigate new legislations, they are forced, they've got no time, they've got no resources to actually understand this legislation that's being pushed through. Then, of course, they will be forced, sometimes physically pushed into the right voting queue in the Houses of Parliament by the whips who want them to vote the way the leader wants the vote to go. So you have overworked MPs with no time or resources to study new legislation, being forced to vote the way their leader wants. It might as well be an absolute monarchy, quite frankly. And this dysfunctional Parliament has the power to veto almost anything the devolved parliaments want to do. Absolutely unacceptable situation. We propose an English Parliament built in the centre of England, possibly Birmingham, but you know, anyone can come up with an equally middle of England location. I'm sure other people can come up with other ideas, but possibly Birmingham, built in the round to get away from the bear pit of the House of Commons in Westminster, where the noise and behaviour of the MPs favour the louts and the thugs who went to public school, but is in no way conducive to good governance. The MPs would be elected, mandated, subject to recall, and paid the average wage. The Parliament would elect a Council of State, which would be the equivalent of the Cabinet. It has a long history. Cromwell appointed a Council of State from 1649 to 1650, and Tony Benn also suggested it in his Commonwealth Bill of 1992. The major function of this English Parliament would be to pass legislation that has been suggested by local, regional, and citizens' assemblies. So the legislation ideas are coming from the people, not being imposed top down by that committee. The constituency work of the MPs would mainly be carried out in the local and regional assemblies, leaving MPs free to concentrate on new legislation and debate new legislation with good knowledge. having been advised by people who actually have the subject knowledge to give good advice. This is the problem with not only parliamentarians, but also with the civil service. They're all generalists. In the civil service, in order to get promotion, you have to change departments. So civil servants may have only had 18 months in a department, and then they're moving on to a different department. So they never have any time to really accumulate good subject knowledge of the department that they're in. And the same, of course, goes for parliamentarians. So if this kind of English Parliament that we envisage were to come about, the chances of good legislation that is for the many and not the few is being passed, of course, is considerably greater. Thank you.
Jennifer Devlin's going to talk about public ownership of the land. We think is a fundamental building block of a Commonwealth of England. But anyway.
Right. I hope I'm going to make the Republican case for the public ownership of land. And how should a Republican group perhaps advise an incoming government? Tony Benn, in Common Sense, his book on where he set out a new constitution for Britain, his Commonwealth of Britain bill, said that Britain, the textbooks say, is a constitutional monarchy. In practice, it's a feudal state, upholding and entwined with a series of public institutions. The time has come to refound our public institutions upon the principles of the common weal, democracy, and an internationalism more in tune with the needs of the 21st century. And this is very much in tune with our latest document, which defines our aspiration as all land in England, currently owned by the Crown, is the property of the Commonwealth, the sovereign people of England. The use and distribution of land is under the democratic control of local and regional citizens' assemblies, subject to national laws and taxes decided by Parliament. So, first question is, at the moment, what is the state of land tenure in this country? And we have to start with a bit of history, I'm afraid, and it's William the Conqueror, who, when he came to Britain in 1066, laid claim to all the land in Britain. And that claim's actually never been relinquished by subsequent monarchs. So technically, all of the land belongs to the monarch, or the crown, as we might call it. And he issued estates to his lords, the first landlords, and they parcelled up some of that land as further tenancies to their landlords and to their underlings. But crucially, the land remained in the ownership of the monarch. The lords held the land on the basis of leases. Some land was held on the basis that the lord would provide services to the monarch, men for his army, or food and other services produced from the land which they held. And that arrangement was known as leasehold. We still have it today. At times, though, the monarch would urgently need actual money, cash, to prosecute wars, for example. And then lords would give cash in return for a different form of ownership or tenure, a grant of freehold on the property. So we have the two forms, freehold and leasehold. And those still exist, as we know. But the key thing is the land still remained the property of the monarch or the crown. And the fact that this has not changed over the centuries is confirmed in an explanatory note to the 2002 Land Registration Act, which begins, "The Crown is the only absolute owner of land. All others hold an estate in land," and it then goes on to explain freehold and leasehold. So when Steve says in his definition of what we want, the Crown owns all the land, he's absolutely correct. There are only two exceptions, one of which is Cornwall, which is owned not by the monarch, but by his eldest son. And Scotland, which since 2004 has replaced feudal tenure and the Crown's interest in land ownership by a system of outright ownership of land by the people of Scotland. So over time, there have been significant changes in land tenure, beginning with the dissolution of the monasteries in 1351 under Henry VIII, which redistributed about 20% of cultivated land. So it was a really significant change. And then, of course, you all learned about this in school, enclosures, which began as early as the 12th century, accelerated in the 15th, and actually continued right up to nearly 1970. And it's estimated that 1/2 of all British land underwent enclosure, and most common land was lost in the process. So enclosure radically changed not only the pattern of land tenure, but the pattern of the landscape. So the large common fields were lost, and they're replaced by small fields with hedges and fences around them. By the mid-19th century, the concerns were being raised about the loss of recreational space, which led to the Commons Preservation Act 1865 and the Commons Act 1876. So we see some commons are still preserved. And I was reminded of this when I travelled down to where I grew up in Hertfordshire, and noticed that on a pleasant Saturday evening, cricket was being played on local commons around that area. So they do still exist, but tend to exist in very, very posh areas, in my experience. There's also, where I grew up, a common which was given over to the pasturing of ponies in accordance with some very ancient land tenure rules and regulations, and that still existed. But these are very few and far between. I mean, Marx rightly described the enclosure procedure as a long process of theft. So you could describe it as the route out of feudal domination, because people no longer had feudal landlords to the same extent. Instead, that was replaced by immiseration and depression for the majority of rural families who lost their ability to live from the land around them. Because one of the things the commons had given them was the right, they didn't own the land, but they had the right to take firewood, to pasture animals on the acorns, for example. And they also had a share of the big common fields to grow some of their own food. But of course, on the other side, it provided a landless workforce which supported the Industrial Revolution. Some aspects of the the enclosure of land were very brutal, as we know, and we know about the Highland clearances, which resulted in hundreds of thousands of Scottish people actually leaving Scotland altogether and going to the United States, for example. Moving on, the Chartists in the 1840s, the Chartists were agitating for land reform. And they actually had a land plan to give small holdings to the rural poor, but that was unsuccessful, obviously. By the 1870s, people were talking about the land question. 1870s was a time of economic depression in Britain, and there was a growing outcry about what was described as the monopoly of land ownership. Landowners denied that this existed, of course, but there was a survey in 1875 which revealed that the suspicions of the majority of the population were true. Virtually all land was owned by approximately 4.5% of the population, and the rest owned nothing. Now, after the 1870s, we see the growth of public ownership of land for the first time, up to the First World War. The British state, separate from the Crown, became a significant landowner. And some of the examples of this land being taken into public ownership would be for county council farms. If you've ever worked in a local authority, you might have noticed that there are residual farms. I think they've all gone now, but belonging to local authorities. So they were actually landowners and farmers. And by 1926, that took up 1.5% of the total land area of England, which is quite significant. There was land for new state functions, nature conservation. So in the 1930s, the London Green Belt was established. In 1919, the Forestry Act set up the Forestry Commission, and that became an absolutely massive landowner. There was a land settlement program which was designed to give 5 acres per family. And there was the Ministry of Defence, of course. By 1945, 20% of the entire British landmass was owned by the Ministry of Defence, which is absolutely staggering. And then there was land to expand existing state functions like housing. Pre-1930, this tended to be taken up around towns, so it was a sort of mainly peri-urban greenfield sites, some of the LCC estates, for example. And later, public land was taken by programs of massive inner city slum clearance with the extensive use of compulsory purchase. And interestingly, from 1918, the Labour Party was committed to land reform, including land nationalisation. Between 1945 and 1979, there was a kind of consolidation of the public estate with significant acquisition relating to those existing state activities such as forestry and housing, and new activities such as the NHS, for example, and privatised public nationalised rail services, together with an extensive programme of nationalisation associated with the extensive application of Keynesian economic policy after the Second World War. So water, railways, coal, electricity and gas were all taken into public ownership. And then there were other reasons for taking land into public ownership. New towns, for example, 32 of them across England and Scotland. And I've got to say, I was fortunate to grow up in a new town. And it wasn't until I left and went to university that I realised that not everybody in the country grew up in decent housing with indoor toilets and a nice environment to live in. I had no idea. So the new towns, new roads. I grew up in Hemel Hempstead, which was right next to the M1, and that was the first of the major road building programme. Yes, Carol, the new towns were extremely well designed. There were parks, there was town centre redevelopment, there was housing, and at the time, public bodies were able to acquire land at existing use value, which made a huge difference. Now, my first job after graduation was in the Greater London Council in the planning department, specifically in the recreation section, which was obviously the butt of many jokes. But that was led by the first woman director of the Royal Town Planning Institute, Sylvia Law. And she had a programme for establishing a network of public parks across Greater London so that within a quarter of a mile of everybody's home, they could expect to find a small open area, the sort where you'd push the pram, take the baby, with some swings and seats to sit on, that kind of thing. And then a little further away, you would expect to find a large park with more facilities, and so on. So there was this whole hierarchy of parks. And I can remember when I was there, they were actually acquiring land, still acquiring land, to develop what was at that time called, I hope it was an interim name, the North Camberwell Open Space. So it was still active then. But under the Tories, when they came in 1979, this was all regarded as very profligate and wasteful. And Keith Joseph reviewed land holdings on a massive scale and developed a new concept of surplus land, and the inefficient use of land was identified. And land was being sold off quickly and not always wisely. Now, the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947 included a development tax or betterment levy, call it what you will, which meant that it was 100%, which meant that the whole of the improvement in the value of land acquired through planning permission had to come back to the public. It's not the case now. This was opposed by the Tories, who were back in power in 1951, and by 1953 it was gone. The 1960s and 70s, however, saw Labour attempting to thwart profiteering from unearned value of private developers with the Community Land Act of 1975. That was Harold Wilson, and the Development Land Tax of 1976. Both of which were abolished by Thatcher after 1979. I think you can see where we're going with all of this. The 1970s saw a rise of financial land ownership, insurance companies, pension funds, hedge funds, all investing in land because it's easy, because you just hold it as a capital asset, it's safe, and it rises in value without any activity on your part. And the early 1970s saw a massive rise in land prices and intense speculation in land, which the Community Land Tax and the Development Land Tax from Harold Wilson had been designed to counteract. Martin Wolf of the Financial Times noted that 21st century capitalism was dominated to an extraordinary degree by what he described as a ruinous trust in land speculation as a route to wealth. By the end of the 70s, owner occupation accounted for 55% of housing stock, but 1/3 of the land was still owned by the aristocracy and gentry by 2010. So just to give you a flavour of the distribution of land ownership, 60% belonged to private individuals, 20% to the public sector, of which central government departments, including the NHS, account for 5%. The Forestry Commission, local government, including fire and police authorities and common land, nationalised industries. And then there were other institutions accounting for 20% of the land. That's the church, the National Trust, universities, the Crown Estate, and industrial and financial landowners. So broadly, the pattern is between 1875 and 1970, there was a massive accumulation of land by the public sector, followed by 40 years, 1980 to 2020, of disposal of public land. And it's estimated that 8% of British land mass has been transferred from public to private hands through privatisations, sales of land from the Ministry of Defence, school playing fields, thousands of school playing fields sold off, public housing through right to buy, surplus land, so-called surplus NHS land, which actually isn't surplus because the NHS needs to grow, but the land that it might have grown on has been sold off. Forestry Commission land, which has been sold off for cash. Local government land, of which 60% was sold between 1980 and 2020. So in effect, 6.6 million local authority dwellings in 1979 were reduced to just over 2 million by 2015. And that was as a result of right to buy. Privatisation failures. There were claims for benefits of selling land, that it was value for money, that local communities would benefit. Matt Hancock, you remember him, claimed that communities would spring to life when surplus public land in their area was sold. Didn't happen. The affordable housing argument, the requirement to achieve full market value of land from the sale, of course, militated against affordable housing, so that didn't happen. Land allocation to non-building companies, in other words, speculators, means that land is tied up, not available for important uses such as waste, energy and transport services. And the government continues to privatise land without any strategic plan or the appropriate levers to ensure it's used in the public interest. In other words, neoliberalism dominates. There's no land value tax, so it's a jungle out there of companies trying to acquire land off market. I've had an approach to buy my back garden by just something shoved through my door. Would I like to sell it? And we're getting the development of land barons brokering deals in a hidden world. There are no penalties for just sitting on land because there's no land value tax. So land value gains are entirely free. So we're told to believe in free market efficiency, but the conditions for free market in land just don't exist. So the outcomes of all of this are things like land banking and hoarding. Who benefited most from the privatisation of land? The corporates. Rentier capitalism is the new development. As more and more land is privately held, landlords have demanded more and more in rent. That's something Adam Smith predicted in The Wealth of Nations in the 18th century. Rich people turn to property to hold as wealth. These aren't the entrepreneurs, the hard-working wealth creators that we're told about. These are rentier capitalists who sit on land. There's massive social dislocation because capitalists behave according to the dictates of capitalism. So if they own a large estate of rented properties and find a more profitable use for it, they simply evict the tenants, demolish it and redevelop it as more profitably. And there are several examples of Ministry of Defence accommodation being used in that particular way. There are many more examples. So what should a Republican group dedicated to the values of a democratic, socialist and secular state do? Well, obviously, we have to demand the public ownership of land. But in the meantime, we need some control over private gains by socialising gains from planning permission, some kind of proper inheritance tax and rules governing inheritance. And we need to get rid of risk mitigation that's been brought in, like build now, pay later, which actually mitigates the risk that owners of land might take when thinking about development. And we need to exercise the control over new uses of land. I haven't really got time to go into this, but there are things called new assets, which are ways of using land to financialize every aspect of land, not just the land itself, but the ecology of it. And we need to bring free ports and economic zones within proper planning and tax regimes. Here endeth the lesson.
Well done, Jennifer. Thank you very much. Thank you to both of you. Before I open, obviously going to open it up to comrades, just to say that an English Parliament and the public ownership of land are central to what we're talking about. But when you see most left policies, if you like, most left platforms or programs that we've seen in this country, these are two things that are completely missing from the rest of the left, are really not considered. The House of Commons is taken as a given. Maybe we'll have proportional representation, but it's not really addressed seriously. And public ownership of land, again, is not something the left, that Corbyn didn't campaign on that, and most of the left organisations standing in this election didn't do so. So these are things that I've seen that Mike, I think, just checking whose hands are up. I think I've seen Mike's hand. Yes, Mike is the first person to go. Right, Mike? Thank you very much. Let's hear what you want to say.
Yeah, that excellent presentations, and the stuff about land especially was really, really interesting, Jennifer. Just on that, and just to amplify some of what you said, with regard to the privatization of land and spaces, now these include, and it continues, um, these sort of urban waste spaces upon which kids used to play, but which used to form, an informal sort of common area. Now they are private and they are used as money generating exercises by the large impersonal corporates. Try and find out who actually owns one of these things, and you go through a whole host of shell companies and PO boxes and all the rest of it. But if you remember, this started to become a thing, if you recall. Do you remember the latter days of Thatcher and the rise of the cowboy clampers? Those guys who were paid by landowners to go around and clamp and then tow away vehicles which were parked apparently illegally on land which people didn't know was illegal very often, and had to pay a king's ransom in order to recover their vehicles. I mean, this became such a Wild West that eventually, it had to be regulated to some extent. But there is still this isn't just London, this is many major urban centres, certainly many larger cities. There are places where you just cannot stop or linger because it is private, and yet they are on the street. I had an example of this 2 years ago. Greater Manchester, went for a conference, parked my car in because there were train strikes, parked my car in multi-story car park, in which, as it turns out, well, they were very keen to photograph you going in so they could charge you. There was no CCTV inside, and I had a theft out of my car. My mountain bike got nicked, and which I subsequently recovered. But there was a bloody great hole. So before I made the journey back to Suffolk, I had to get this repaired. So I had to come out from the multi-story car park and park on the street. Now, several weeks later, I got a letter from anonymous land company saying that I had parked illegally in a place where I was not supposed to park. They produced photographic evidence which clearly showed an autoglass vehicle doing what autoglass vehicles do, but that didn't bother them the slightest. I was just a means of making money, the means of appealing, as often in these situations is virtually impossible. So that's one whole thing, the making of money from really what have been historically public assets by anonymous private corporations. The other thing I just wish to say is around the whole question of use of public land for leisure. Jennifer, you touched upon it. Many towns and cities are blessed with some, significant parks. Even here in Ipswich, there are some lovely parks, and London's parks are, of course, really well known. However, in England, I think it is only 2% of the whole landmass that we can explore and wander in unhindered. The right to roam does not exist, whereas in Scotland it was introduced not a handful of years ago and has been a massive success. We had in the 1930s, or was it late 20s, the mass trespass of Kinder Scout in the Peak District, where people demanded, coming out from the cities, demanded to be able to explore through that national parks, through that, absolutely kind of impossible to understand network of public footpaths, bridleways, riding a mountain bike as I do, where I'm allowed to go and where I'm not allowed to go, is a matter of, significant difficulty in understanding. Government recently in England and Wales, and certainly with the Welsh government, is looking to try and do what Scotland has done. However, in England, they looked at expanding people's rights to explore the countryside, and under Johnson, and they rejected it. They were massively lobbied by the big landowners. So status quo remains. There's all these, bullshit sort of public health messages about go out and into the countryside. It's good for your mental health, and it's good for your physical health too. Well, where the heck are people supposed to go? When the government has just reiterated its support for the mass holding of vast areas of land by a handful of large landowners. So the whole question of the right to explore and the right to roam our countryside is a very live one. And I predict that in England, it's going to become, we had an issue around Dartmoor last year, where an attempt was made to deny people access to a part that they historically had access to. And that caused a real furore, and to some extent the landowner had to back off. But I predict it's going to become a real live issue. And, there's going to be more mass trespasses. I hope I will be in the forefront of them if possible.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Land and Parliament is about ownership and control. And now I've seen that Mark put something. I've seen that Mark put something in the chat. I think it's a book called Who Owns Britain, and I see Mark's got his hand up. But before that, Peter's had his hand up, so I'm going to take Peter and refer to the chat where Mark put this book. I think it's one that Jennifer and I both read, Who Owns Britain, unless it's another one. But anyway, but before we go on to Mark, who's got his hand up, I'm going to Peter. Okay, Peter.
Yeah, thanks, comrades. That was a very entertaining talk and presentation. I certainly didn't know that the Crown, the King or Queen, actually still owned all the land. As I said, I think, I thought we've gone through various stages of where their holding had been dissipated to a certain extent. But I think it's indicative of looking at the way the aristocracy actually holds land, quite large areas of land attached to their country piles. If you look at one individual that had a little bit of a shindig around Chester for his marriage, forking out a load of ice cream for all the populace, the Duke of Westminster, and he's one of the richest men in the country, and one of the biggest landowners, and he's got it because he's an aristocrat, and they took advantage of the enclosures and all the rest of it, and kicked the commoners off it. So it does tie up with them. But the other thing I wanted to, because Jennifer actually did mention it, is this issue of common land. Now, common land, people think of it being, like a piece of land in the middle of a little country village, nice cottages, thatched roofs, and all that game. And yes, that is those are commons that are still under the Common Acts. But the real big commons are the ones like up in the northwest that we have, up here, the moors. Where my little farm was located in near Rochdale, we were actually commoners, because we had in our deeds title to the farm, that we had rights of access and rights of use of this common land, and this common land wasn't a small area. It was the moor, the whole of the moor. So if you're in Rochdale or Manchester or anywhere like that, and you look up towards the moors, you can see how big an areas these are. And what it gave us was the right to graze, which is the important thing. We had the right to graze sheep and cattle, horses, goats, anything that would eat grass. We was allowed to have on that moor, but it was restricted in the amount of animals that you were supposed to keep. Nobody takes any notice of that. They have thousands, hundreds more than they should do, and that's why there's a problem of overgrazing on these places. And the land, the common that we were under, was owned by a bloke called Dearden, again an aristocrat. He lives in New Zealand, and he has the ownership of this massive common, and he didn't give a tuppenny halfpennies about the how the common was. He never invested anything in it, never came anywhere near it, until they found this really good money making scam, windmills. And they could put windmills up and across. If you look from Manchester up towards Rochdale and all along the hills there are masses of windmills, and they're raking in an absolute fortune. You're talking about the smaller of them actually generating an income of £30,000 tax free per year, and the money that these people are gaining off this now are absolutely, you're talking about them turning into billionaires. So that's what my and the commoners, by the way, still have rights enforceable by law. They control the common and what goes on it. So anyone that wants to build anything on it, they have to come to the commoners to get their okay on it. And the commoners have regular meetings in order to dish out stuff for their own advantage. But the other side of this, as Mike raised, is right to roam. There is a limited right to roam in England. It's not the same as in Scotland, but certainly on this massive common that we have up in Rochdale Way, you do have the right to roam over that common. Now, one of the things, I'm not trying to put my NFU hat on, but there is a problem with like an unrestricted right to roam, because you're talking about farms. If people are accessing farms, farms are a workplace, and it can be dangerous. It can be a very dangerous place. The amount of farmers that are actually killed and very seriously injured every year is quite horrendous, really. And the problem a lot of farmers have, not the big massive industrial farmers, not talking about them, we're talking about the small holding type farmers, that they are very concerned about people coming into what in effect is a factory with machinery, and people getting hurt, and especially with livestock, because you put livestock in a field, especially bullocks or a bull or anything like that, that can cause, people have been injured and killed by them. And that there is, I think, is a problem that needs to be looked at and overcome. But the issue of who owns land, and it has to be, as Jennifer says, about the Crown, and it has to be taken away from them and given and made democratic. So you make democratic decisions on what that use of that land is going to be. Nobody's suggesting we boot all these farm, which is what the Tories said. We boot in all these farmers and people like what I was doing at my little holding. We're not talking about booting them off. What we're talking about is democratizing the rights to use them holdings and to stop this total exploitation that's going on, and this money-making racket with windmills at the same time. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to go straight to Mark.
The two speakers were brilliant, I have to say, and the ideas put forward. And you said there's a leaflet. I'll certainly use that and circulate it. Don't want to go into that. But the bit about the land ownership, which is a subject I know, I think you would use the word immense amount about. For those who don't know, even before I started writing and getting paid for it, I did work for the Land Worker magazine of the TNG, now Unite, which actually is the oldest trade union magazine in the world, having been first launched in the second decade of the 20th century. Obviously, much smaller numbers of people read it now, but I probably do about 30 articles a year for the magazine, and at least 2 or 3 of them will be strongly influenced by the issue of land ownership. Most socialists are completely and utterly uninterested in the subject. They have absolutely nothing to say about it. They don't see it as being an important issue whatsoever, and rarely wish to engage in a discussion on the subject. My own experience, and you can see it on my website, a little bit of stuff. Firstly, there's a booklet on there which is about Benny Rothman's biography, which it's about 60 pages, which Unite published 5,000 of them about 6 or 7 years ago when I was doing work for them. But there's also reference to a book when I moved back up to the northeast at the beginning of this century to help look after my dad at that point in the later stages of his life. Myself and a lad called Trevor Bark, who was in Class War, put out a book called The Rich at Play. It's fox hunting, land ownership, and the Countryside Alliance. It should be noted that actually Blair said of all the legislation that he passed, the legislation to prevent fox hunting was the worst, and in some respects it caused him the most difficulties, the most amounts of problems. But the reason why they could go roaming and they can engage in fox hunting is because they own most of the land, and especially in Scotland, where the imbalance is even greater despite recent changes in land ownership than in England. Britain as a whole, I understand, remains the second most imbalanced land ownership in Europe after Spain. One thing which is of note, that in the many campaigns that were formed after 2010 against the Tories, one campaign which we were successful as a group of people was in preventing the selling off of large amounts of forestry. Unite in particular was influential in that, but loads of environmental campaigns and people prevented the sell-off because it was recognised immediately that once this land was sold off, we wouldn't be able to actually use the forests, which people find is a great place to go for recreation. The figure in terms of actual how much land we can actually roam across is 8%. Was the figure. The land value tax obviously is essential, and at one point the Greens and Labour Party have both been people in favour of it. In other words, for example, my friends who live, and this is working class friends of mine who have homes in Hackney, prior to the the Olympics going off, their homes might have sold for about $500,000. The same homes these days, you wouldn't get one for less than 2.5 million because of the investment that has gone into that local area. And the argument is that some of the profits to be made from these houses, if and when they sell them on, should go back into the state. So public money is invested in that land and it boosts the prices of houses. And by rights, the public should get back some of those monies. One quick point, not all of the designs of some of the new towns were exceptional. My own new town, Peterlee, which you'll be aware of, is the only town in Britain named after a trade unionist. Itself might have had good design work, but that didn't stop them building half the houses with asbestos panels and asbestos roofs. So the consequences long term for that was pretty poor. Kevin Cahill's book, I'll put the link into that, in my view, is one of the greatest books ever written, because what Kevin Cahill did was to bring to light the actual imbalance in land ownership. The speaker made reference to like a survey which took place in the 19th century, and that was in 1872, when it proved possible to show who owned the land. So after that, there was never going to be another survey taking place, and that did prove the case until, exceptionally recently things. The Land Registry Acts was set up in 1925, so technically you could find out who owned the land. But the truth of the matter is, if you didn't sell land after 1925, you didn't have to register it. And so what Kevin did, and Kevin was the election aide of Paddy Ashdown at the time. So he was a Liberal Democrat. They both were, but they felt that land ownership was imbalanced as such. So when Blair brought in legislation and other bits of stuff, they were already on the ball. They'd already started to do the research. Currently, 20% of land is still not registered, so you can't actually tell who owns the land. They are supposed to be bringing that up to date, but it's taken an inordinate amount of time to do so. That's it. One thing I would say is, if anybody's particularly interested in the manifesto that Charlie Clutterbuck, with my support, put forward for the use of land ownership, not the nationalisation. The book was, after all, published by Unite and was actually squashed by some of the hierarchy at that particular point, with all sorts of things like book burning and that sort of stuff taking place. I forgot what it's called now. Bittersweet Brexit. The title was terrifying for some of the trade union. For some of the trade unionists and Jeremy Corbyn's office, and that's called Land, Labour, and the Case for Food, and that's on my website. The case we put forward was quite simple: switch the £3 billion from the Common Agricultural Policy towards subsidising 300,000 jobs at £10,000 a year, and thus take the money away from those people who own the land, who not only pinched it, but it's a bit like they pinched your grandfather clock, and when it stopped working, they came back to ask you to pay for its repairs, because that's what's happened. Landowners not only have land which should be ours, they actually get paid for owning that land. So it's a double whammy in that respect. But as I said, great that you're holding the meeting. But as I said, the left as a whole has no interest whatsoever in this subject, none at all. Don't care about it. In my experience of talking to people for the last quarter of a century, not interested in the slightest. Finally, I'd like to make great praise for Kate Ashworth, who has been the secretary of the Open Space Society, which was set up in 1865. They've done a Herculean job in defending and also extending the rights on commons. They've protected numerous commons, which would have been undoubtedly be sold off. And I know she's retired now, but I think she's very much a liberal in that respect. She's certainly one of my heroes for the work that she's engaged in. Sorry, my throat's a bit sore. Anyway, like I said, cheers. And very good speakers, very good speakers. I mean, as I said, this is a subject, the land stuff, I know a huge amount about. But they were both excellent, really good, excellent.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Thank you, Mark. And just to say, Mark, that you've come to the right place, because for us as Republicans, the land question is absolutely central. So, I mean, it's the fact that the left in England doesn't really do republicanism either, by the way, and they don't do land. These all go together. They're not separate things. So we're trying to reshape the politics of the left and land. That's why we've got land here on in what we're doing. And that is connected to the question of a parliament to be able to take control of lawmaking, and those things go together. Having a democratic system of a democratic parliament and getting control of the land, it all fits together. And so I didn't know this about you. I know I'd only found out all the football stuff, Mark. But hopefully hopefully with you and Jennifer and the rest of us, we can get together to do some more work on this. Because to be absolutely honest, it's central to what we're talking about, and we're the only group, I would say, on the left that is taking this topic seriously. So you found a home in that sense at this moment, and hopefully we can use some of your expertise with what Jennifer's done. Mike, can we hear back from you again, but try to keep it relatively brief?
Yeah, it's only brief, and it's really partly in response to some things that Peter said. But yes, thanks for the figures, Mark. Agriculture is indeed a dangerous occupation, and a difficult and challenging one, because people are working quite largely on their own. And mental health is a real issue. The amount of suicide amongst farmers is significantly high, I think only matched by the amount of suicide amongst GPs, particularly at the moment, where some GPs, incidentally, I was reading even today, are forced to go and work at Asda because there's no longer funding for GP practices, or in one case work as an Uber driver instead of a GP. So yes, farmers and GPs are the two really significant numbers of solely employed people who face great mental health crises, and where there is quite a lot of suicide. I take your point, Peter, in the light of all of that. And, because I also was born on a farm, funnily enough, and there is a need to be able to manage the land, to make sure that fences are maintained, to make sure that crops are not trampled, to make sure that animals are not let out, etc., etc. Carol, don't overstress, by the way. The cows are not killers. It is very rare. Cows are normally very benign.
Very risk averse, Mike.
But I think this can be done. You towards the end of it, Peter, you were saying we need to find a democratic means of mediating these issues, and indeed we do. The evidence from Scotland since the right to roam was introduced is that there has been minimal difficulty, even for the pedantic large landowners and their bloody grouse moors, have had very little to complain about. In fact, the ones in England have had more to complain about when people have tried to stop them creating their horrible peat fires, which, they're actually the burning of the heather, which then creates a peat fire, which then dries out the peat levels, which then contributes very significantly to the rise in CO2. Government has tiptoed around this, but of course, again, will not challenge the big landowners. But no, the right to roam has caused really very few difficulties for farmers, landowners, other than those who really want to find an excuse to complain.
Thank you, Mike. I'm now going to come back. I don't see any other hands up at the moment. I'm going to come back to Jennifer and then to Carol. And just to say that what's come up is that we see how important land is in terms of with food production, leisure, housing, environment, transport. All of these issues are all tied up and tied around with that question of land. So, and hold on a minute, I see a hand going up here, and it's just as we're about to finish, John. Now you've gone and stuck your hand up. Look, can we just take you, but not vote? Can you keep it brief, John, please?
I think Country File on a Sunday is among the more progressive things on television, and they cover a lot of issues that are important in relation to the countryside. And I really do think that if we're going to make a breakthrough in terms of the land programme, we should really try very hard to get people like Mark, Jennifer, Mr. Cahill, if possible, interviewed on that programme about the land question. I think that they might be tempted. I don't know, we could fail, but I think the attempt ought to be made.
Okay, thank you, John. Okay, I'm going back. I will throw out just a little question, maybe a question, because one of the bills that went down in the wash-up because of the Sunak calling this snap election, there was a bill that Gove was doing around the question of freehold and presumably leasehold, but certainly freehold, and that's another very important issue for many people. I don't know, Jenny, if you've got any comment to make on that. And that takes us back to the Parliament, of course, which didn't manage to pass these, and the fact that the power in the hands of the Prime Minister means all those very important bills just went in the dustbin because Sunak decided he wanted to have an election at the time of his own calling. You know what I mean? So anyway, Jennifer.
Sorry, I missed the Gove draft bill. The one that I was glad to see disappear was the one that would have given the government powers to completely exterminate the badger population of Britain. So I was quite glad about that, because it's farmers, not badgers, that are responsible for the problems in cattle. The first thing to say is thank you very much for forcing me to research all this. As a one-time geographer, economist and planner, I was very grateful to be required to look into all of this. It's been of great interest to me, and I have to acknowledge my debt to Mr. Brett Christophers, who wrote the new enclosure, The Appropriation of Public Land in Neoliberal Britain. I've put it in the chat. It's a really fascinating book. What can I say about leasehold? I'm not an expert. This is a legal matter, freehold and leasehold, and I think we all struggle with it. I just don't know. Sorry. What else do I want to say? I do think we urgently need to do something about the socialisation of the profit that's being made on land by landowners who are just sitting there and watching the value rise and having extra value added by planning permissions being given and not having to pay anything for those benefits at all. That needs urgently to be dealt with, I think. That will be my main message. As to bringing all land into public ownership, nationalisation of the land, I mean, it will be intriguing to have a legal brain looking at this business of the fact that all land is owned by the monarch or the crown, and therefore people only have a title to it, because that would surely make it easier to actually nationalise land. But I'm not aware of any work that's actually been done on that. I should love to see it. Thank you very much for the comments and for the interesting chat afterwards. Thank you, everybody.
As a comment as we move on, we don't know who's, as Mark said and Jennifer said, we don't really know who owns all the land. A lot of it we don't. But it's interesting that William the Conqueror, by the way, he did the Doomsday Book, which meant that in a very short space of time, he sent his people to every single village and town and every single place, and they made a list of who owned exactly what, even your sheep and your cows and your plows and absolutely everything. It can be done. You know, he did it because he wanted to control the whole thing. We don't have that information deliberately. It's deliberately kept secret from us. So if William the Conqueror can do it in short order, I think we can. But for that, we need our own parliament, Carol, I think. So let's come back to that question of why you think that's very important for our democracy.
Well, since nobody's actually asked me any questions, I assume that everyone is totally on board with getting an English Parliament and a decent one at that, without all the vagaries of Westminster, which is just a bear pit and run by the Crown with no accountability to Parliament whatsoever. So I really feel that we do need an English Parliament that runs properly, where people have time to debate and find out about new legislation, where those new legislation ideas don't come from the top, from some committee, but come from the people themselves, from regional assemblies. And the regional assemblies will have picked it up from the local assemblies and from citizens' assemblies. So that the ideas for legislation come from the people. They go up to a body which has time to study it, to formulate it properly, because they'll have the information at their fingertips and they'll have the time to discuss the legislation, and therefore the legislation that passes will be good legislation. And it won't be for the benefit of the corporations or the landowners. It'll be for the benefit of the people. Absolutely. And that's what's so important.
Thank you, Carol. I think that's the end of what we're going to say. Next week, we're going to look at our manifesto or platform that we will be, as it were, unveiling. We're going to be talking just to members maybe tomorrow, but next week we will put our platform manifesto forward. And I'd like to think that we've got something different to say to most of the rest of the left in the two items that you've heard tonight, which are central to our Republican view of the kind of changes that we need to make. So I hope that's been informative. I've enjoyed that. Thank you for our speakers and the contributions from the floor, as it were. And Carol, I think that's where we now say goodbye to everybody and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.